Hello, this is Tim Congdon, Chair of the Institute of International Monetary Research at the University of Buckingham. Usually these monthly videos are about money and banking and macroeconomic trends reflecting these developments in money growth, but at the moment, this is March 2025, the global economic outlook is dominated by developments in the USA under the Trump presidency. And I'm going to look instead at a major geopolitical issue. There are negotiations at the moment between the United States and Russia, which appear to present these nations as in some sense equals, as if Russia were a superpower. What I want to do in the next few minutes is to explain that this is not true. And this is very important, not just in terms of the exchanges between Trump and Putin, but also in terms of the European response and the impact this has on their economies. Plainly, there are now increases in spending on defense. They will have impacts on budget deficits that will affect monetary growth, may affect inflation. So this is all part of the larger picture. The first point I want to make is that the most basic measure, in a way, of economic power is the figures for gross domestic product. Now, I'm going to present these numbers in terms of current prices and exchange rates. I'll talk about that in a second, but current prices and current exchange rates. And here is a chart where I compare Russia's GDP with that of the West, excluding the USA. Now, you can see there that the GDPs of all of Germany, Japan, France, Britain, Italy are above those, and Canada are above those of Russia. Indeed, if you add up the GDPs of those nations on the left, their combined GDP is 12 times that of Russia. So, putting it this way, Russia plainly is not a superpower. It is at best a medium-sized economic nation, somewhat larger, say, than South Korea or Turkey, but that's all. Now, you sometimes get the objection here that we should be looking at these things in what's known as purchasing power parity, meaning, for example, that if we were to value a haircut or a cup of coffee in a restaurant in Russia, that the GDP would be higher in this context relative to the other nations. I put it to you that that is irrelevant. What matters in the context of a war is the ability to buy advanced military, to buy or to produce advanced military equipment, including the components that go in. And what's relevant for that is GDP in terms of nominal prices and exchange rates. In that sense, Russia is not a superpower at all. Indeed, it's really a relatively minor nation relative to not just the United States, but the entire non-American West. Well, that's the first point to make, and that if we're thinking about warfare, we're thinking about the ability to produce sophisticated, advanced military equipment. Let's then try and work out the ability of Russia to produce this kind of equipment, given what other things we know about its economy. Let's now look at the composition of its exports. We have numbers here for exports in 2023, when Russia's exports of goods were somewhat over $400 billion. Now, of that total, by far the most important element was exports of oil and gas. In fact, they were well over half of that figure. But then If we then look into the other component, the other elements in Russian exports, lots of different bits and pieces. There's iron and steel, fertilizers, aluminium, and so on. What I want you to notice is that there's no advanced exports from sophisticated manufacturing, high value-added manufacturing in this total practically at all, apart, you might say, from military equipment, to which I'll return in a second. So Russia's GDP is very small compared with that of the non-US West, and maybe we are talking now about a world in which America isn't going to act as the sort of nuclear shield, the protector of Europe and Japan and so on. But even that overstates Russia's significance in this context. Given what I've just shown you, it has no serious advanced manufacturing capacity. What then about military equipment, you might say? Because surely that does require that a nation be right at if it's going to be exporting military equipment, be right at the frontier of technology, be right up at the top if it's going to continue to export weapons. And after all, don't we believe that Russia has been an important weapons exporter ever since the Second World War? Well, it certainly was in, say, the first 50 years after the Second World War. But more recently, in the 21st century, the situation is very different. I'm going to use now some figures from, if I can find them, some figures from the Stockholm-based think tank, SIPRI, which looks at these kind of numbers. And what we do here is you compare the 10 largest exporters of military equipment, and we look at their global market share in the 5 years 2014 to 18 inclusive, and then the 5 years 2019 to 23 inclusive. You see, not surprisingly, that the biggest exporter is the USA. Then there come a number of nations, and you'll see that Russia is in there. Russia was indeed quite important in the 2014 to 18 period, the mid-2010s, when it accounted for about 21% of global arms exports. But you'll see there's been a change between those two 5-year periods. Between those two 5-year periods, the Russian share fell by 53%. Now, some of that may have been because of diversion of weapons to the Ukraine war in 2020, 21, 22, and so on. But I have to tell you that the latest figures for 24 are a further collapse in the share of Russian exports in the global arms market. Why? The problem is that Russian military equipment is no good. Obviously, there has been the Ukraine war now lasting over 3 years. At the start of it, the one area of equipment where Russia appeared to have a big advantage over NATO was in things like tanks, armoured personnel carriers and so on, where their numbers are much higher than those of NATO. In practice, these tanks and armoured personnel carriers and so on have been devastated by drones, and practically, certainly over half, probably a higher ratio than that, of the tanks that Russia had at the start of the war have gone and are useless. Russia's biggest customer for weapons, for defence equipment and so on, has been India. But India is changing that at the moment, moving to the USA because of understandings between Modi in India and Trump in the USA. In other words, the Russian share of the global market in defense equipment has collapsed because the weapons are no good. Do I need to say anything more? I mean, plainly, Russia has had 3 years to defeat Ukraine, which accounts for less than 0.5% of world GDP, Ukraine, which certainly at the start of the war was not supposed to have any serious defense capacity at all. Russia is not a major superpower. It is not a nation which can produce weapons matching those of the West, either the USA itself or the non-US West. And any kind of spending that we carry out in defence needs to bear that in mind. I don't deny that, obviously, with Russia having nuclear weapons, it is a dangerous and nasty beast. But having said all that, Russia is not a superpower, and we should always understand that. I'll just finish by saying that there's this move at the moment towards isolationism and protectionism in the USA, and I'm afraid there's retaliation to the tariffs that Trump is imposing. There are some parts of the world today that have complete free trade. Hong Kong, still in communist China, but it's complete free trade. Singapore and United Arab Emirates. I can remember as a young man, in fact I was just a kid, Khrushchev said, because of their supposed rapid economic growth in the Soviet Union, we will bury you. The Soviet Union was supposed to have so much growth, so much prosperity that eventually the West would be buried. Russian imports last year were lower than those of the United Arab Emirates. In the 1950s, the UAE was a poor, backward set of fishing villages protected by Britain. That's how much the world changes, and Trump and others should understand the world we're living in. Thank you.